the throttle to reduce the closing speed, get a bead on the target right away, hold it, and never mind the streams of tracer darting overhead. Just keep on pressing the button until you think you're going to collide, then stick hard forward. The job of the Spitfires was to get a good old dogfight going with the German Messerschmitts, and down would come the Hurricanes to get at the bombers. The two aircraft together, the Spitfire and the Hurricane, plus the radar stations. Those were the things that won the Battle of Britain.
Since the beginning of war in the air, man has found ways of killing his fellow man up there. Basic air combat techniques were developed and refined in biplane scouts over the trenches during World War I. For nearly 20 years after the Great War, the biplane fighter was the dominant combat aircraft. But the relentless advance of progress soon made it obsolete. The Schneider Trophy seaplane races during the 1920s and 30s were a particular spur in fighter development. Advances in airplane engines and aerodynamics developed for racing soon found applications on combat aircraft. But even as late as the mid-1930s, highly maneuverable but lightly armed biplane fighters and bombers still dominated. But this period marked the switch to a new generation of monoplane combat aircraft to replace the last biplane fighters, such as the British Gloucester Gladiator. Compared to the biplanes, the German Bf-109 and the British Spitfire and Hurricane introduced far greater performance and firepower. The first of these new fighters to see combat was the Messerschmitt Bf-109, which fought against Soviet Polikarpov monoplanes during the Spanish Civil War. Led by World War I ace Werner Mulders, the Germans developed new tactics to make best use of their fighters' performance. By the middle of 1938, the German Air Force, or Luftwaffe in Spain, named the Legion Condor, was master of the Spanish skies. Gradually improved versions of the Bf-109 were introduced, including the cannon-armed Bf-109E, the Amel. And Mulder's new tactics were to prove the foundation of all modern fighter warfare, giving the Luftwaffe a clear advantage in the earlier stages of the greater conflicts to follow. During the first year of World War II, the German Blitzkrieg smashed everything in its path. And spearheading the way for Luftwaffe dive bombers and attack aircraft was the Bf-109, which quickly and ruthlessly established complete air superiority over Poland, the Low Countries, and France. By mid-1940, only Britain lay unconquered in Europe. Developments from the Schneider Trophy Race aircraft reached their ultimate expression in the Supermarine Spitfire. Designed by Reginald Mitchell, it was undoubtedly the best British fighter of World War II. The first Spitfires entered service with the Royal Air Force in August of 1938. Along with the Hawker Hurricane, it was to form the backbone of Britain's air defense at the outbreak of war 1 year later. Arguably, the most graphic and effective use of fighter power in World War II came during the summer of 1940. Having conquered mainland Europe, Hitler now turned his attention to the invasion of Britain. On the 1st of August, 1940, he issued a directive from his headquarters. In order to establish the necessary conditions for the final conquest of England, the Luftwaffe is to overpower the Royal Air Force with all the forces at its command in the shortest possible time. Operation Seeloo, Sea Lion, had begun. At Hitler's disposal was the might of the Luftwaffe, with over 2,500 combat aircraft organized into 3 Luftflotten. These were the world's most modern fighters, dive bombers and bombers, crewed by pilots who had gained much valuable experience in Spain. In their favor, the British had the advantage of newly developed radar and a chain of stations to give long-distance warning of approaching German raids. These were tied to an effective air defense control network. The first heavy raids struck at Royal Navy convoys in the English Channel. Stuka dive bombers were supported by Bf-110 long-range escort fighters. The Luftwaffe had an overwhelming numerical superiority over the RAF, whose fighter command could muster just 36 squadrons of Hurricanes and Spitfires. Soon, their pilots were being scrambled several times a day to engage the Luftwaffe in furious air battles. One of these pilots was Flying Officer Geoffrey Quill, who became renowned as the chief test pilot of the Spitfire. He fought for a time with number 85 Squadron at Hornchurch in Essex.
When the battle heated up, the job of the Spitfire squadron was to climb up and engage the fighter escort and let the bombers go by. We'd see a bloody great formation of bombers coming up at 12,000 feet. We'd be told to ignore them, up above their fighter escorts. Our job was to get up and engage those fighters, get a real good old dogfight going, get everything milling around, during which time the bombers would be groaning inexorably along. With any luck, by the time they got anywhere near the target, we'd have forced all their fighter escorts out of position, and down would come our Hurricanes to get at those bombers.
Major Adolf Galland led a group of the most successful German 109 fighter squadrons, Jagdgeschwader 26.
We made a surprise attack from a favorably high altitude. I glued myself to the tail of the plane flying outside on the left flank, and when, during a right-hand turn, I managed to get a long burst, the Spitfire went down almost vertically. During this first action, we lost 2 aircraft. We were no longer in doubt that the RAF would prove a most formidable opponent.
The Luftwaffe's onslaught, christened Adler Angriff, grew fiercer during mid-August. On the 15th, one raid of 70 Heikel bombers set off from Norway to attack northern England. It suffered severe losses.
We had time to go around and come at the bombers from behind. There were the usual 109s above and behind. some Ju-87s, about 30 of each. I throttled back a little and went through a whole lot of Stukas, letting fly with everything I had. I'd never seen so many aircraft. We broke through the haze, and you could hardly believe it. As far as I could see, there was nothing left but German aircraft coming in, wave after wave. When I fired, bits flew off, the hood came away, and then the pilot bailed out. He looked incongruous, hanging there, a wingless body on a parachute in the midst of this jewel of winged machines.
A 109 destroyed, buddy, yes.
Oh, good show. How'd you get on, sir?
I had a wonderful party, thanks.
Are you all right? You get any of the batters?
Yes, I got a Messerschmitt 109 and a Dornier.
After the particularly intense period of fighting between the 12th and 18th of August, both sides paused to lick their wounds. Stuka losses to RAF fighters had been particularly severe. Hermann Goering, the Luftwaffe commander, ordered their withdrawal from the battle and planned his next moves. The RAF took the opportunity to regroup its forces. Its primary concern became the protection of its airfields. Sir Keith Park, the tactical commander, ruled that fighters should attack the German bombers and avoid unnecessary dogfights. A new phase in the Battle of Britain was beginning. Goering had ordered the movement of more Bf-109 fighters from Cherbourg to the Pas de Calais. With an operational radius of only 250 kilometers, the Bf-109's combat was limited to only 15 and 20 minutes over southern England. From the 24th of August, the Luftwaffe stepped up its attacks and mounted a round-the-clock offensive intended to exhaust the RAF. Feint raids were made to set up and confuse radar operators and ground observers who gave advance warning. The real raids were made up of even bigger bomber formations than before. Group Captain Peter Townsend took number 85 Squadron from its base at Debden once more into battle.
As we closed in on the bombers, the Heinkel's turned away seawards. A dozen Bf-110s cut across us and immediately formed a sort of defensive circle. And a moment later, the Bf-110s had banked clumsily across my bows. In its vain attempt to escape, the machine I was bent on destroying suddenly looked pathetically human. It was an easy shot. Too easy. For a few more seconds, we milled around with the Messerschmitts. Then down came a little shower of 109s. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw one diving for it, pumping shells. A quick turn towards it shook it off, and it slid below, then reared up in a wide left-hand turn in front of me. It was a fatal move. My Hurricane climbed round easily inside its turn. We were climbing, trying to reach the bombers. Kept well away from those fighters. It wasn't easy, though, them sitting on top of us, able to strike as they pleased. Better move out towards the sun. But a dozen Bf-110s now pinned us down. Every time they dived out of their defensive circle, I called, "Leave them alone," and wheeled the squadron towards them to shake them off their tails. Then the inevitable. Down came the Bf-110s. It was each one for himself. When my BF-110 came firing, I whipped round and caught him doing a fatal turn across the sights. Tightened the turn, nose up a little, and I had him. The ME-110 staggered, and then stalled and dived to earth near Hastings.
The RAF was perilously close to defeat. Flying 5 or 6 patrols a day and in combat nearly every time, the pilots were exhausted.
There were 14 to 15 hours of daylight each day. We were on duty right through. Chaps were being lost all the time. We had 17 out of 23 killed or wounded in my squadron in less than 3 weeks. We had another 8 aircraft shot down with the chaps unhurt, including myself, twice.
In spite of the RAF's success in shooting down bombers, the intensive German attacks were having an effect. A great deal of damage had been done to the airfields, and particularly to operational control. And the timing of successive raids had given the RAF hardly any time to rearm and refuel. The German High Command began to think that it was close to victory. It gave orders to prepare the invasion barges. And meanwhile, the bombing of the airfields did not stop. By the end of the first week in September, all Britain knew that the Germans were about to invade. It looked as if the day had come on September 7th. First radar reports began to come in of several 100-plus raids heading in. Assuming that they were bound once more for the airfields, Park ordered 11 squadrons aloft and put his remaining 10 on 2-minute standby. But by mid-afternoon, it had become clear that the massive raid was heading for London. Civilian damage and casualties were severe. Invasion Alert Number 1 was issued. Attack is imminent. Prime Minister Winston Churchill promised, "We shall fight on the beaches, we shall fight on the landing ground. We shall fight in the fields and the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender." But Hitler and Goering had committed a fatal strategic blunder by switching the attacks away from the RAF airfields to the cities. The raids continued throughout the night, once more with heavy civilian casualties in London. Hitler came to the conclusion that Britain might now sue for peace without the need for invasion. Churchill, however, never thought of the struggle in terms of the defense of London, but only who won in the air. Adolf Galland wrote,
Any encounter with British fighters called for maximum effort. One day on my way back from London, I spotted a squadron of 12 Hurricanes north of Rochester, attacking from 2,500 feet above them and behind. I shot like an arrow between the flights, and from a running distance, fired on one of the aircraft in the rear line of the formation, tearing large pieces of metal out of the plane.
Every night of the week, the bombers came and wrought havoc on London. But there was a respite of nearly a week for the RAF. The climax of the daylight battles came on the 15th of September. The Germans lost 38 bombers and 24 fighters. Hitler postponed Operation Sea Lion until further notice. The summer of 1943 saw the U.S. 8th Air Force starting its daylight strategic bombing offensive against the Third Reich. It had been thought that the mutual protection given by heavily armed bombers flying in tight formation would be enough protection. Heavy losses in early raids proved that this was a costly error. Escort fighters were the only answer to counter the Luftwaffe. Raids were escorted part of the way by Spitfires in P-47 Thunderbolts, with subsequent heavy bomber losses when they could not keep up all the way to the target. Eventually, the introduction of drop tanks and the development of long-distance flying techniques allowed the Americans to gradually increase the P-47's range. By late summer of '43, they were beginning to take an increasing toll of German fighters. And a true long-range escort fighter arrived in the form of the P-51 Mustang. The twin-boom P-38 Lightning completed the American trio of escort fighters. With twin drop tanks, the final version had a range of 3,700 kilometers, sufficient to escort bombers to the very heart of Europe from bases in England. With fighter escort all the way to and from their targets from the Little Friends, the bombers were able to carry out their principal aim, the destruction of the German war machine. During one 5-day assault in February of 1944, the Germans lost over 150 fighters. By 1944, the Luftwaffe was clearly on the defensive. The Normandy landings opened up another European front, and the Luftwaffe found itself in combat in the east, the west, and in Italy. As the German army was forced back within the boundaries of the Reich, so the ferocity of the air fighting increased as the German fighter pilots struggled to defend the fatherland. Threatened by fuel shortages and Allied fighter attacks on their air bases, the Nazis still managed to put up a desperate fight. On the Eastern Front, the Soviet counteroffensive was gaining momentum. In March of 1944, the Luftwaffe could field a daily average of 330 fighters along the entire 3,000-kilometer front to cover the retreating German army. Opposing them were around 3,000 Soviet aircraft, of which roughly half were frontline Yaks and Lavochkins. Astonishingly, the Luftwaffe was able to display its traditional skill and fight back. By March 1944, two fighter wings, JG-51 and JG-54, had each shot down a total of 7,000 enemy aircraft. With each bombing raid, the Allies could squeeze the Luftwaffe a little harder. Faced with a mounting fuel shortage, those pilots able to fly were engaged in intense air battles. Losses of combat experienced pilots are not replaced.